Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of the book of Job. That was close. The book of Job, chapter 30. So, part 2, if you will. Let's see if this works from here. Let me turn it on first. There we go. This was the illustration that we started with last week. Just that I was personally pretty excited and stunned to learn something else. There's a long list of things I don't know, and this was one of them. In my recent visit to the McDonald Observatory at Fort Davis was to learn about the telescopes and their history and to discover that a part of the lunar expedition was to put 3, we did 2, the Russians did 1, 3 reflectors on the moon. A laser was mounted on the telescope so that they could measure precisely the distance to the moon. Those that were doing that were startled to discover that the moon was about 142 feet further away than they expected it to be. Now, at first I was like, oh, well, that's still pretty close. But what they began to realize over the years since then, that was in the 60s, what they've measured since then is every year the moon is moving away from the earth about 1.5 inches a year. Which means eventually the moon's going away. Now, we probably don't have to rush anything we're doing, but that's an interesting idea about how old the universe is or how old it's going to be before there's change. There's a sense of limitation to the universe that you and I enjoy. The reason why I wanted to include that was to say it brought 2 things to mind. That's something I didn't know, and I don't know what to do with that exactly. And if ever that's true, it's in this question about why does God allow bad things to happen or painful things to happen? There's a lot about this I don't know because I'm trying to understand why God does something or allows something. So I'm going to say the same 2 things. There's a lot I don't know about this, and then I don't understand or don't know what to do with some of the things I do know. And so we broke up this into 3 sections last week. We talked about some hard answers about why does God allow evil or suffering or bad things or struggles. We talked about some head answers to try to at least get some sense of, well, what are some explanations as to why God would allow this. But then tonight I wanted to go a little different direction and talk about more of a heart answer. Because I don't know about you, when I was little, we all piled into the station wagon. Does anybody remember station wagons? We all piled in the station wagon to go to church one Sunday morning when my father was he and our family, he was a missionary in Idaho. So we got in the car. It was a cold winter day, a foot of snow on the ground, and he started to back up to go to church. And in doing so, he ran over my puppy. Yeah. I'm okay, though, years of therapy, and I'm getting to where I can talk about it now. And it killed the puppy. So we all get out of the car. There's the puppy. It's not good. We're all bawling. And so Dad's not feeling real good, because there's just 3 kids crying. His wife's crying, and he's the guy that did it, and all that sort of stuff. He's like, oh, just go in the house. So he sends us all in the house, and he gets a shovel, and it's frozen Idaho, and so we're gonna try to bury the dog. Well, the little church knew something was up because we weren't there, so the little church of about 30 or 40 folks or so drove to our house. Yeah, that's what happens when the preacher doesn't go to church. They just come. You can run, but you can't hide. You know what I mean? So the whole church comes out, and so here's Dad. He's embarrassed, and so the guys dig a hole in the frozen ground, and so Dad has an impromptu funeral service for my puppy with the whole church there. Very sweet. I don't remember who. I just remember it being a maternal figure, one of the ladies in the congregation. I just remember sort of this shadow coming over me and them hugging me and saying these words to me because I'm sobbing, I'm crying because Bear was his name. He was a cute little guy, and he did. So I'm sobbing, and she scoops me up and she says, "Don't worry, you can always get another one." Now, she was right. That's what I call a head answer. That's true. But one of the things the Apostle Paul would teach us in Ephesians chapter 4 is that we would give an answer that was not only the right answer, but it was given at the right time, and that it was given to edify. So she was right, but I don't know that that was the best time to say that. Well, she was a prophetess, because less than 6 months later, I had another one. Okay? So what I'm calling the hard answers are true. Push the button, okay? There it is. It's true you will get another puppy, but it doesn't always necessarily help in the moment. So what I would like to do tonight is talk about some things maybe that might help in the moment. So this is just review from last week. The number one, that God is not the creator of evil. He has given us the ability to choose, and because we have the right to choose, that makes God accountable for providing the potential for evil. So he doesn't have to create evil. We do just fine with that on our own. But however, because we have choice, then you and I have to live in a complicated universe as we're all affected by each other's choices. That may be true, but that doesn't feel necessarily good. Number two, God can and does use suffering to bring about good. That is true. Some of those painful experiences in my childhood, your childhood, were formative and important and even critical to the positive development that you have experienced. So that's also true, but that doesn't always feel good. So here's how Job says it in chapter 30, in verse 27. We'll start with verse 26. He says, "When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. I am seething within and cannot relax. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning without comfort. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help." I don't know if Job's words resonate, these particular words resonate with you, if you can think to one of those moments, or you might be in one of those moments now. Job is a beautiful book, difficult book, but a beautiful book. That one of this last things, God can and does use this to accomplish good. In Job's life, besides which we will explore what God was doing with Job for Job, one of the ways that God has used suffering for good is that you and I tonight will benefit from Job's suffering. How many millions of people have benefited from Job's experience? Now, that's a head answer, but if you were to walk up to Job and say, "Job, here's the good thing. In roughly, 3,500, 4,000 years, there's going to be some folks in Midland that are going to really appreciate what you're sharing." Is that going to help him right then? Well, it might make sense, but it doesn't do much with the hurt that he's going to have to endure. Secondly, we also talked about last week as far as hard answers, they're just true, but I don't like how it sounds or even how it feels, is that some of the harsh things that happens is a result of God simply enforcing justice. Similar to the second one, that our choices have consequences. A simple example is, if you jump off the roof, you are probably going to break something. Because there's a principle of gravity and effect, and most of the time God is not going to intervene. He could. He probably does more than we realize. But suffering may be the result of our choice to jump off the roof with mom's favorite Afghan. They don't make good parachutes. Okay? So that makes sense, but that doesn't really change how I feel or help me with how I feel. So, what are the possibilities when we think about why God allows these things to happen? As we've read, Job is experiencing or expressing intense pain. Well, Elton Trueblood said, "It is a problem which no theist will avoid and no honest thinker will try to avoid." It's a fair question. I believe that God is bigger than any questions or doubt that we may have. He can take it. what I learned probably more than anything else from the book of Job, because for years I was guilty of reading the first 2 chapters of Job, the last 4, skipping the weird stuff in the middle and saying, yeah, I've read Job. But Job is an experience that you go with him through peaks and valleys. And the thing that I was most amazed by this book, the book of Job, was that Job experiences and expresses the full gamut of emotion. I mean, by chapter 3, he's expressing a deep depression. He expresses an anger. Sometimes as Christians, we want to rush in a little too quickly and say, you shouldn't feel that way. You need to get over it. God's in control. Where's your faith? Those things are true. They're head answers, but they may not do much for the heart. What Job did was he expressed anger toward God, frustration toward God, disappointment toward God, depression, withdrawal, upset with his friends. I believe that you can see the entire range of emotion. And what I found so freeing when I got to the end of the book is I was waiting on God to smack him. Waiting on God to say, don't you talk to me like that. Don't you give me that attitude. You better get happy. That's kind of what I was waiting on God to do, and he doesn't. God never accuses Job of sin in any of that response. In fact, the odd thing is, God gets aggravated with Job's friends, not with Job. Now, God's going to go back and forth with Job because God's going to finally break the silence after nearly 38 chapters of Job saying, why is this, and I don't like this, and all of the emotions and the up and downs. God finally breaks in and begins a conversation with Job. But God never shames him or scolds him or tells him he was wrong in expressing those emotions. And then it dawned on me that I don't know of any place where the Bible commands us or tells us how to feel. It tells us what to think. It tells us how to act. It tells us a proper belief or proper actions. But the Bible never legislates, you better feel this way about this. Human emotion is free to be what it is. For example, in Ephesians, Paul would say, be angry, but sin not. The actions we are held accountable for. Our attitudes we're held accountable for. Our thoughts we're held accountable for, but not our emotions. And I found that freeing. God is big enough to handle our frustrations, disappointments, questions, challenges, all of that. His love is not going to be shattered because we're upset with him. I would summarize, as I shared, we went through an experience when our daughter was about in junior high and she got sweet on a boy, which is always a bad thing. She told me one time, Dad, you need to smile more often. And I said, why? She said, because all my friends are afraid of you. I said, perfect. But she got sweet on a boy, and I told her, no. She looked at me, and I said, no. And kind of had to get firm with, no. And it bothered her. And so a week or two went by or so, and she said, Dad, can I talk to you? And I said, yeah. She said, I thought you talk about being a Christian and loving people and being generous and all that sort of stuff, and you're being real harsh. I said, yes, I am. She said, why? 2 questions. Do you believe that I love you? Yeah. Do you believe I'm going to do what's best for you? Yeah. Then the answer is no. What I couldn't tell her is I was involved in that process on another side because that young man was having some serious legal difficulties even at that age. And I was having to be a part of some depositions and some witness, and it involved some bad things with young girls. Totally not appropriate for me to tell her that, right? But totally not okay for me to say, yeah, sure. So I had to say no. And I was counting on 2 words, which I think the whole Bible is God just saying 2 words. The same 2 words I was counting on when I said, trust me. Now you think about when we struggle and we say, God, why not? And you think about all the information God has that I'm not aware of. And God, for various reasons, one just may be, could I even comprehend the answer if He gave it to me? Because what He does with Job is, well, Job, do you understand? And then He goes through the series of different creation examples. Do you understand the horse that gets excited in battle? Do you understand the eagle that soars on the wind? Do you understand the stars that hang on nothing? He goes through 2 chapters plus of those kind of, do you get any of that? No. Then you're not going to be able to get the answer if I gave it to you. So God is really saying 2 things. Do you believe that I love you? And do you believe I want what's best for you? That's really the bottom line. It doesn't answer my questions. It doesn't answer the whys, but it gives us a start. So let me back up and let's talk about some of the possibilities. There are 3 words we use to describe God: omniscient, the idea that God knows everything, and we can recognize this is true about the character of God but just at looking at His creation as we have the last number of weeks. How much wisdom does it take to put together the universe as we experience it? How much knowledge does it take to craft the human body? To put the earth in the proper relationship with the sun, with the proper orbit and the seasons and the moon's part in the gravitational pull of the oceans. And we could go on and on. We've shared already numerous examples. That's an example of how wise God is. You got to be really, really intelligent to design what you and I live in and who we are. Secondly, we talk about God as omnipotent. Well, there's all 3. Omnipotent in that He can do anything. He has all power. You also can see that in His creation. Turn, if you would, to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. 15 minutes, really? Okay, that's not good. Romans chapter 1. Here's how Paul would say it to us. In verse 18, he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." So creation is what we call general revelation. We can see these characteristics of the Creator just looking at the creation. If you were to walk up to somebody's painting, if you were to walk up to somebody's craft, if you were to walk up to somebody's restored vehicle, in other words, if you were to walk up and look at something someone has done, you can draw pretty good conclusions about them based on what they do. If you see a really good painting, you could think about their love for art, their love for beauty, their sense of color, those sorts of things. And so in creation, we can see God's omniscience, we can see He's omnipotent, and then also that God is omnipresent, that He's everywhere, and that's demonstrated in God's concern for us. That God has always been with us because He's concerned for us. And so we see that in God's agape or unconditional love. So the question goes like this. When we struggle with why does God allow things, which 2 out of 3 combination works? Of these 3 characteristics of God, that He has wisdom, that He has power, and that He has love, is how I would summarize these 3 things. Which one of these could we take out? We could say, well, God knows everything and He can do anything, He just doesn't care. You could say, well, God cares and He knows everything, He just can't do anything about it. Well, God cares and He can do something, He just doesn't know what to do about it. So the Bible presents these 3 characteristics of God as all 3 being true at the same time. So, then, here's the other approach, letting Job share with us his insight. This is a problem that we have in this conversation. Turn to Job chapter 2. I think it's interesting that Job 2:9 and John 9:2 parallel each other. Isn't that interesting? The way the numbers, I saw that today and I went, hey. Because what happens when we suffer, we are so desperate for a why, we want to understand so we can put it in a box, that the first thing we'll often ask is, whose fault is it? Who's to blame? So, as Job is just reeling from the impact of all of his tremendous losses from the first chapter, his possessions, the people that works with him, his children, and his own health. He doesn't have much left. So in verse 7, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd, or a broken piece of pottery, to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Verse 9, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. I wished more was said about Job's wife, because there's a couple different things you could do with this. But if nothing else, she's saying it's not worth it. Give it up. She seems to see it's not worth trying to trust a God who would allow such things. Most of us can at least relate with where she's coming from. Now remember, she's a mama standing next to the fresh graves of her own children. So this is not an academic theological pursuit for her. This hurts bad. Can't even imagine. Now let's go to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. In John chapter 9, verse 1, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Now, it's the same kind of question, not with the emotional intensity of Job's wife, but they're not standing in the same place either. For them, this is a little more comfortable theological debate question. The assumption, though, is it's somebody's fault. Who sinned? Who's God mad at? Who is God punishing that he'd be born blind? Now, the reason why this is like the perfect theological conundrum or puzzle, because you can't answer this either way. Because if you say, well, the parents sinned and God's punishing the parents by giving him this child, well, the obvious response is, if the parents sinned, why is God punishing an innocent child? Why didn't he punish them? Why don't he strike them with blindness or at least a rash? Right? Why is God punishing the innocent? So to be fair, the conclusion must be the child's done something and God is fairly punishing the child. Which brings up another question. What was the child doing in his mother's womb? Watching TV shows he shouldn't have been watching? That doesn't make sense either. The child hasn't even been born yet. It's born blind, so he's already punished for something he's done when he hasn't done anything yet. That doesn't make sense. Whenever we find ourselves in a tangle, here's something I've learned a long time ago. Entanglements are man-made. Jesus said, just in the next chapter, he'll say that he has come that we will know the truth, and the truth will make us free. God's in the rescue, redemption business, not the entanglement business. So when I run into a knot where there's no escape, there's no way of salvation, there's no way to get better, that's not what God does. So the fault is the assumed question, who sinned? The assumption that suffering is the result of God punishing somebody. That's not always the case. Go back to Job chapter 4. Now, Job has some really good friends. They come to him. Not everybody came to him. They sat with him for a full week in silence because of his suffering. Not everybody did that. But once they start talking, it kind of goes downhill from there because they're working from the same assumption that Jesus' disciples and we often do. In chapter 4, verse 7, they say, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed?" Innocent people never suffer is another way to say what they just said. So if you're suffering, that means you're not innocent. In chapter 15, look at in verse 20. Here's some more encouragement they have for Job. "The wicked man rise in pain all his days, and numbered are the years stored up for the ruthless." They say several times, poetically and bluntly, "Job, you must have really messed up. Wow." And so it creates this struggle where Job is having to say, "But I didn't do anything." And they're like, "Oh, that is so arrogant. I can't believe how self-righteous you are." Fortunately, we know from the first chapter that God said Job was blameless and righteous, that this is not about him sinning. He's not perfect. He's still a human being. But his suffering is not a direct cause of how bad he is. So, they don't know what to do. That's the simple answer. Here's the hard answer. When God does answer Job, God never gives him an explanation. But there's something better than that. God gives us himself. Suffering is not from an unfeeling God or an uncaring God or a distant God, but from a God who weeps with us. Have you ever disciplined your child? Probably the most vivid memory I have of being a new father is when our daughter, our firstborn, was, I want to say that those shots where she was 9 months old. I'm always wrong. Okay, go with me on that. She's a little baby. And we go to the doctor, and she's going to have to get some shots, some inoculations. And so I'm holding her, and she is asleep in my arms, and I'm talking to her, and I'm rocking her. And I'll never forget, the nurse comes in, and they have to bring the needle in 3 pieces because it won't fit through the door. And they put them together, put up a derrick, and she brings out the syringe, and I'm holding Andrea, and Andrea is asleep. She's kind of fluttering. She's mostly asleep, you know. And the nurse goes, "Pah!" And I'll never forget Andrea's face. Her eyes popped open. She took a breath. I knew she was going to wail, but she looked at me, and it just crushed me. She thought she was safe in her father's arms. There's Dad holding her and protecting her, who would give his life to defend her at the drop of a hat, no problem. What's a better, safer place to be than in your father's arms? And then all of a sudden, ow! Where did that come from? And I had no ability at her age to say, the reason why we're doing this is... Ruth chickened out, cried, and left the room. I had to be the betrayer. And she squalled and cried, and it was one of those, I think that hurt me more than it did her. Why would I do that? Because she needed it. I had no ability to explain it. I really didn't have even any ability to prepare her for it. I just had to let it happen. But I can tell you that after she was in pain, whether it's that example or a discipline example or a heartbreak with some boy or whatever it was, I can tell you my response is always the same. I'll hold you. I got you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I got you. I think there's a reason why God reveals himself as our Father. There's other places where he's also described from a mother figure too, the nurturing and care and love also. But in this picture, God protects us. He may allow some things that he can't explain, maybe can't even warn us about. But what he will say is, but I'm right here. What God does is give himself. Jesus in the flesh suffers mightily on our behalf to show us the way home. God could have stayed out there somewhere and let us just spin off into our own, but he gets so involved, he becomes one of us and hurts with us, suffers with us, so that we could be home. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks to us in our consciousness, but he shouts in our pain, that our pain is a megaphone that God uses to rouse a deafened world. Hey, pay attention. Because when they were little, you could hold them and bring them to things. As they get older, you have to you gotta learn this. Because we're running out of time, we'll simply move through these 4 points. One of the things that God can do with our pain is, number one, God can use our trials to direct us. If you're writing notes, you can write James chapter 1. Consider it joy when you encounter various trials, because these things bring about perseverance and development in your life. This will be in your notes that you can look at. I'm just going to blast through it. There's not a fill-in, but these things are here. Number two, God can use our trials to inspect us. A wake-up call. Just to see, I think there's an expression, people are like tea bags. You don't really know what's in them until you put them in hot water. And so sometimes it's not until we encounter a trial that we really understand what's going on the inside. God can use trials to protect us. On one particular occasion, a man lost his job. And it was bad, and it hurt, and it was scary, and all that. 6 months later, the business got indicted because of illegal practices. And all of the folks that were still involved in that went down with the ship. He had already been let go, so he was in the clear. Wow, that was a happy coincidence he lost his job. Part of it may be that God is protecting us. What if something else is coming down the road? What if there's something at the next intersection? We don't know what's coming, but he does. So maybe there's an alteration of the path because that protects us. We may or may not see what he's protecting us from. And lastly, God can use our trials to perfect us. Romans chapter 5. That's where we're going to learn maturity. That's where we're going to grow. That's where we're going to be refined to be closer to him. Most of us have newlywed stories that are pretty similar. It's a story of love and poverty. Right? I mean, and when you're on this side of the fence and your children are getting to that age, even if you had the ability to just write big checks and take away those issues, I don't know that we would or should. Because so many wonderful memories and wonderful experiences come when the only thing you have is each other, which is how it should be. Maybe in a similar way, that's what God wants with us. Sometimes poverty, if you will, whether it's financial, relational, whatever it is, so that we learn that what we have that matters most is him. So what's the hard answer? Yes, you will be able to get a new puppy. That's a head answer. The hard answer is, I'm sorry. Let me sit here with you. Let me hold you. You go ahead and cry, and I'll cry with you. That's what God does. God's solution is to experience it with us. For the bottom line is that God will promise to always walk with us. Jesus said at the end of Matthew that I'll be with you even to the end of the age. That he'll never leave us, never forsake us. Well, finally, you do have a decision to make. Choice means we can decide whether our pain hardens us or softens us Someone loses a child to drunk driving or a family member, they become very bitter and enraged. But another person endured the same loss and founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It can be positive or it can be negative.